Most camping trips end with marshmallows, bad guitar, and stories nobody remembers. This one ends with 6 missing people and a girl who, officially, never existed. A group of old college friends finally managed to reunite for a weekend in the woods. No phones, no work, just a fire and a few drinks, until one of them shows up with an extra guest. No one knows where she's from. No one remembers hearing her name before that night. Around the fire, she doesn't tell a ghost story. She describes a nightmare about an endless scream in the forest, a hidden concrete bunker, and a man inside who caused it all. Then she turns to the group's organizer, the one who planned the whole trip, and says that in her dream, that man is him. By the time the sun comes up, everyone but him is gone. Their cars are still at the trailhead, their phones are still on, and the girl who started it all, according to every record anyone can find, she was never there. Every year, back in college, Ethan was the one who organized the camping trips. He booked the cars, nagged people about gear, made lists, picked trails. His friends joked that if he ever stopped planning things, they'd all just sit in their apartments until they turned to dust. After graduation, work and bills and breakups started pulling them apart. The trips got less frequent. Then the pandemic hit, and the tradition died quietly without anyone really admitting it. Years later, when a random Tuesday left Ethan staring too long at an old group photo, he snapped a picture of it and threw it into the group chat. Same spot this fall, 2 nights, no excuses. The replies came in slower than they used to, but they did come. Carla, who used to sneak booze into the campsite in shampoo bottles. Jonah, the horror movie addict who argued with strangers online about obscure directors. Priya, who always packed half her apartment just in case. Nate, who laughed at everything until it wasn't funny anymore. Riley, who had gone quiet over the years but still sent the occasional meme. One by one, they said yes. Ethan picked a state forest that wasn't too far from any of them. It had marked trails, a small lake, and just enough no-cell coverage zones to feel like a real escape. He sent maps, weather screenshots, even a dumb Spotify playlist called "We're Not That Old." By the time the weekend rolled around, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, like his life still had a center. They planned to meet at a gravel trailhead just before dark. Cars rolled in at different times, packing the little parking lot with familiar dents and faded bumper stickers. There were hugs that lasted a second too long, jokes about receding hairlines, arguments over who had aged the least. For a few minutes, it actually felt like slipping back into something simple. Then Nate pulled up with someone in the passenger seat. The girl who stepped out of his car didn't match anything Ethan remembered Nate ever liking. She was younger than the rest of them by a few years, maybe mid-20s. Dark hoodie despite the heat, hands shoved deep into the front pocket, hair pulled back carelessly, as if she'd gotten dressed in a hurry and never fixed it. She didn't look shy. She looked tired, like sleep was something that only happened to other people. Nate shut his door and walked around to her side. "This is Mara," he said. "Hope it's cool she tagged along." Nobody said what half of them were thinking. Nate had never mentioned Amara. Not once. Not in years of late-night DMs. Not during drunk calls. Not even in passing. Carla recovered first. She grinned, stepped forward, and stuck out a hand. "Extra marshmallow rations for new people. That's the law." Mara shook her hand without quite looking at her. "Nice to meet you," she said. Her voice sounded normal enough, but something about the way she stood, like she was deliberately taking up less space than she needed, didn't match her words. Ethan told himself to let it go. People meet online now. People show up with partners, situationships, whoever. They were adults. It wasn't college anymore. Still, when he and Nate walked ahead to do a quick gear check, Ethan couldn't help asking. "Would have been nice to know you were bringing someone," he said lightly. Nate's usual grin was there, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, sorry man, it came together last minute." "Where'd you two meet?" Nate hesitated for half a second too long. "Work," he said. "Kind of. It's complicated." Ethan almost pushed, then let it die. The sun was already sliding towards the tree line. He didn't want to start this long-delayed reunion with an argument. They hoisted backpacks, locked cars, and followed the trail into the trees. By the time they reached the clearing, the sky above the tree canopy had turned that deep blue that almost looked solid. They set up tents in the half-light, slipping back into old roles like muscle memory. Ethan staked out the fire pit. Priya unpacked her ridiculous camp kitchen. Jonah made a big show of reading the instructions on the cheap folding chairs as if they were sacred texts. Nobody asked Mara to do anything specific. She moved around the edges of the activity, silently copying whatever the others did. When someone handed her a mallet, she used it correctly. When Carla asked if she wanted a drink, she accepted a metal cup of whatever was being passed around without checking what it was. The fire caught faster than Ethan expected. Dry wood, low humidity, just enough wind. Soon the logs were collapsing inward, sending up sparks that faded against the rising dark. They sat in a loose ring around the flames. This was usually the part of the night where Ethan would say something like, "All right, horror nerds, who's got a story?" Then Jonah would complain that nothing really scared him anymore, and Carla would insist on only real stuff, no movie plots, and Priya would end up telling something half funny about her weird childhood neighbor. It was a ritual. It never really worked, but that was the point. This time, nobody reached for it. The jokes thinned out. Phones were checked out of habit, then put away again when everyone saw the same "no service" in the corner. Crickets started to fill in the silence between sentences. Ethan caught Mara watching the fire as if it was a screen, and something important was about to happen. "All right," he said. "One scary story each. Old rules. No stealing movie plots, Jonah." Jonah held up both hands. "Fine. Original content only. Support indie horror." Carla volunteered first. She told a story about a rideshare driver who wouldn't let a passenger out. It was more urban legend than personal experience, but she sold it with enough nervous laughter that the others played along. Riley went next, voice quiet but steady, talking about an old hospital she used to drive past late at night. Lights that came on in empty wings, a curtain that moved when there was no wind. They took turns, passing the invisible microphone around the circle. Some stories landed, most didn't. Jonah did, in fact, try to sneak in a movie plot and got pelted with a marshmallow for his efforts. It felt like they were warming up for something that hadn't started yet. When the circle reached Jonah again, he leaned forward. "Okay," he said, "no more warm-ups. One real nightmare, something that messed you up." He looked around the circle, eyes glittering in the firelight. "Mara," he said suddenly, "new person goes first." Carla shot him a look, but Mara didn't react like someone being picked on. She didn't flinch or wave it off. She just kept her eyes on the burning wood. "It's not really a story," she said. "It's a dream, or something that pretends to be a dream." The fire cracked, sending up a small fountain of sparks. Somewhere in the trees, a branch snapped under something's weight. "Go on," Priya said softly. Mara wrapped her arms around herself, as if the night had suddenly turned colder. "It always starts with the sound," she said. "Not a scream from a horror movie. Not the way people pretend to scream when they're playing around. It's like someone tore a piece of metal out of the world and dragged it across concrete until it learned how to beg." The circle went quiet. Ethan's first instinct was to think she was being dramatic for effect. But something in her voice didn't match performance. It sounded too flat, too worn out, like this was the 100th time she'd tried to explain it and the first time anyone had listened. "It's high and it's low at the same time," she went on. "Like there are layers to it. A human throat in there somewhere, but buried under something that isn't supposed to have a voice at all." Jonah shifted in his chair. "Where are you when you hear it?" he asked. "In the woods," Mara said. "Always in the woods. It's dark, but not all the way. Just dark enough that everything a few steps away might be a tree. Or not." She took a slow breath, as if choosing what to leave out. "It doesn't feel like a dream," she said. "There's no weird jump cuts, no flying, no sudden scene changes. Just that sound, pulling from one direction like a hook in the middle of my chest. If I try to walk the other way, my legs feel like they're moving through wet cement." "How far away is it?" Carla asked, her earlier bravado gone. "Too far for a normal voice," Mara said. "Too close for comfort. And it doesn't stop. It never cracks, never weakens. No human could keep screaming that long without passing out or dying. So either it's not human, or something is keeping it going. The logs shifted. Embers slid inward, glowing under a layer of ash. They want to help, Mara said, almost to herself. Normal people. That's what normal people say when they hear someone screaming. I should go help. But that sound doesn't ask for help. It just states a fact. Something is suffering, and you are late. The wind picked up, pushing smoke toward Ethan. His eyes watered. He wiped them, blinked hard, and tried to ignore how his own chest had tightened without permission. In the dream, Mara said, she walks anyway. She tells herself she doesn't have a choice. Every step she takes in that direction makes the sound louder, and every step in any other direction is like pushing against a wall you can't see. She? Jonah cut in. You're not in your own body? Mara's eyes finally left the fire. For the first time that night, she looked directly at someone. Not at Jonah, but at Ethan. The dream doesn't care who she is, Mara said. It just cares that she keeps moving. In the dream, Mara said, the woods didn't feel like a national forest. They felt edited. The trunks were too evenly spaced. The ground underfoot was too clear. No fallen branches in the way. No tangles of roots to trip over. Just a smooth, damp path laid out like a tongue. The trees don't block the sound, she said. They guide it. It bounces off the bark just right so it's always ahead of her, never behind. No matter how far she walks, it never sounds closer. It just sounds bigger. Carla hugged her knees to her chest. Riley stared into the dark beyond the circle of light, as if checking to make sure there were, in fact, regular trees out there. Eventually, Mara said, she sees a shape that doesn't belong. Not a cabin, not some cute ranger station. A concrete bunker, she said simply, half buried in the hill, like the forest grew over something it didn't want anyone to find. No windows, just a rectangle of black where the door should be, like someone erased part of the world with a marker. The scream poured out of that black rectangle, not louder, not quieter, just focused. The door isn't closed, Mara said. It's open, too open, like whatever is inside doesn't care who hears it. It wants witnesses. It wants someone to see what kind of noise a human being can make when you pull them past their limits and keep going. Jonah tried to speak, then shut his mouth again. His usual snark had nowhere to go. In every version of the dream, Mara said, she stops right at the edge of the doorway. One more step and she'd be inside. The scream is so close now that it makes her teeth hurt. Her eyes water. Her vision refuses to focus on whatever's in there. It's like her brain knows that if she understands what she's looking at, she won't survive it. Then don't go in, Priya whispered. Mara's lips twitched, not quite into a smile. That's what a sane person would say, she answered. But this isn't a place that wants sane people. It wants the kind of person who needs to know. The kind who stands on the edge of the worst possible thing and thinks, if I see it, maybe it will make sense. The fire had burned down to a steady bed of coals. Shadows stretched and warped behind each of them, reaching out into the tree line. In the dream, Mara continued, she steps inside. The sound cuts off. Not gradually, not fading into whimpers or sobs. It vanishes, like someone hit mute on the universe. The way you only notice a refrigerator humming when it stops, her ears start ringing from the sudden absence. And in that silence, Mara said, she finally sees him. The word hung there, small and sharp. Him who? Jonah asked, like he already hated the answer. The man responsible, Mara said. The one who built this place, or found it, or let it in. The one who turned a human voice into an instrument. She swallowed, her throat working visibly in the firelight. She sees his face, Mara said quietly. There's a moment where her brain recognizes him before her heart does. That's the worst part. The part where something deep inside her says, of course it's you. The circle held its breath. "And in every single version of the dream," Mara said, eyes back on Ethan now, "it's the same man." Her voice stayed calm, almost gentle. "It's the man who organized the trip," she said. "The one who picked the place, the weekend, the route. The one who brought everyone into the woods." Ethan didn't realize how tense his body had gotten until his back muscles spasmed. He shifted in his chair, forcing out a laugh that sounded wrong the moment it left his mouth. "Okay," Jonah said, half joking, half not. "That's specific." Carla looked from Mara to Ethan, frowning. "Hold up," she said. "You mean like him? Mara didn't blink. "In the dream," she repeated, "it's always him." The fire popped, sending a spray of sparks into the air. One landed on Ethan's wrist. The brief sting felt almost welcome, something simple and physical, a burn he understood. The others turned, almost in unison, to look at him. There was no laughter, no "gotcha," no immediate chorus of "okay, that's enough." They just stared. For the first time all night, Ethan had no idea what to say. Sleep, when it finally clawed its way over Ethan, came in shallow, broken pieces. He dreamed of normal things at first: office corridors, traffic lights, a grocery store he hadn't been to in years. Noise, clutter, light. Then something in the dark pressed down hard on his chest, and he woke up with his heart hammering, unsure at first where he was. Canvas above him, cold air in his nose, a faint smell of wood smoke trapped in his clothes. The campsite. The night before came back in crooked flashes. Mara's flat voice. The way she'd stared at him when she said, "Always him." The silence that fell over the group after that. He checked his phone out of habit. No messages, no signal. 9:47 a.m. Late for camp. He expected to hear zipper noise, someone cursing at a stuck stove, Carla complaining about instant coffee. Instead, the world outside his tent sounded empty. Not quiet, empty. He unzipped the flap and stuck his head out. Everyone else was already up. Not just up, fully packed. Tents collapsed, bags closed, straps tightened. They stood in a loose formation on the edge of the clearing, like a group waiting for a tour to start. 6 of them. Carla, Jonah, Priya, Nate, Riley, Mara. All facing his tent. Ethan said. "Morning?" No one answered at first. Their expressions weren't angry or cheerful or hungover. They looked focused, like a room of people waiting quietly for a meeting to begin. "We're going," Jonah said finally. "Going where?" Ethan asked. Priya answered without looking at him. "We're just waiting on you." The part of Ethan that usually diffused tension with a joke wanted to say something like, "What, did I oversleep the cult meeting?" But the words died on his tongue. "Give it a minute," he said instead. "Haven't even had coffee." He ducked back inside without waiting for a response. As he stuffed his sleeping bag, a thought kept circling. This was still a prank. Some elaborate group bit. Maybe they'd planned it with Nate. Maybe Mara was part of it. If he refused to play along, it would eventually crack. Someone would break character, roll their eyes, admit it had gone too far. He took his time, slower than he needed to be, letting the silence outside push against the thin tent walls. No footsteps, no whispered side conversations, just that same heavy, patient stillness. When he finally stepped out with his pack on, Mara broke eye contact with the tree line long enough to flick a glance in his direction. Then she turned and started walking. The others fell in behind her without a word. They didn't ask if he was ready. They didn't suggest a route. They didn't even check the map. They just followed her. Ethan waited for someone to make a joke about Mara, our fearless leader, or following the prophet, but none came. He realized, with a small jolt, that if he didn't start moving, he'd be standing alone in the empty clearing. His feet made the decision before his pride did. He fell into step at the back of the line. They walked. At first, Ethan tried to map their path against what he'd researched before the trip. He'd spent hours online reading trail reviews, checking for closed sections, printing backup directions just in case. This path didn't match anything he'd seen. The trees grew denser, the undergrowth changed, There were no colored trailblazes on the trunks, no signs nailed to posts. The ground sloped in a way the topographic lines on his map never had. Every so often, Ethan slowed down, stopped to retie a boot, take a drink of water, adjust his straps. Each time the group stopped too. Not all at once, not theatrically. They just halted. Some turned halfway back toward him, some didn't. Mara never did. The message was clear without a word. His pace didn't matter. What mattered was that he stayed with them. An hour passed, then another. Branches scraped his pack. Sweat dried cold on the back of his neck. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if sound had farther to travel. They hadn't talked about a day hike. They had no clear destination, and yet everyone moved with the calm, steady momentum of people following a schedule. Ethan stepped off the path, if it could even be called that, and sat down on a mossy log. He made a show of stretching his legs, shaking out his shoulders, digging into his backpack for a snack. "You can do that later," Carla said. Her tone wasn't sharp, it was flat, like she was reciting a line. Ethan pretended not to hear. He crinkled the wrapper louder than necessary, took an exaggeratedly slow bite, stared off into the trees. He wanted them annoyed. He wanted someone to snap, to break the spell, to drag them back into normal human irritation. No one moved closer except Nate. Nate walked back to him, leaving the others where they stood. Ethan's hand slid into his pocket without thinking, brushing the cool metal of the little folding knife he always carried on trips. "We have to go," Nate said quietly. Ethan looked up at him. "Go where, exactly?" he asked. "Because this isn't on any map I brought." Nate's mouth opened, then closed. For a brief second, something like strain flickered across his face, like he was fighting to pull a word up through mud. "We're almost there," he said finally. "You'll see." The phrase landed in Ethan's stomach like a stone. "You'll see." He didn't know why those two words made the hairs on his arms stand up, but they did. Maybe it was the certainty. Maybe it was the way Nate's voice didn't quite sound like his own. Before Ethan could answer, the forest breathed in and screamed. Later, when people asked him, therapists, detectives, relatives, Ethan always struggled to describe the sound. He settled on this. It felt wrong for the woods. It wasn't an animal in pain, not a fox cry, not a cougar call, not a wild pig. It carried something too articulate to be anything but human, and something layered under it that had never belonged in a throat. It came from somewhere ahead and far away. It came from everywhere at once. Riley flinched, hands flying to her ears. Priya's face went white. Jonah, whose idea of fun used to be playing death metal at full volume, actually took a step back. Carla didn't move. Nate didn't either. Mara, at the front of the group, lifted her head slightly, as if acknowledging a signal. Ethan's first desperate thought clung to the prank theory. Speakers, a recording, some twisted extension of last night's story. But his skin knew better than his brain. The sound didn't vibrate like recorded audio. It didn't come in waves. It pressed straight through his ribs, into the soft parts behind them, into places no microphone could touch. "Someone needs help," Priya said. Her voice shook, but the words came out like a script. "We have to go." The scream didn't pause for breath. It didn't crack. It kept pouring through the trees, steady as a siren that had never been turned off. Ethan took a step backward. "I'm not doing this," he said. Nobody turned to argue. Nobody pleaded. They just watched him. Not angry, not pleading, expectant. For a single, awful moment, he recognized the expression on their faces from somewhere else. Disaster drills, maybe. Safety videos. The look of people waiting calmly for someone to follow the posted instructions. Ethan turned and ran. Branches whipped at his arms. The scream shoved at his back, trying to fill up his spine. Roots snagged his boots. He tore free, lungs burning, mind throwing up images he wouldn't let himself examine too closely. A concrete doorway, a black rectangle, a face in the dark that looked like his own. He didn't look back. If they called after him, he didn't hear it. The scream filled everything. He ran until the trees changed, until the light shifted, until the alarm in his body started to compete with something else. Exhaustion, raw and simple. Belatedly, he realized his pack was lighter. He'd left it behind. Good. No extra weight. No map either. No carefully printed trail descriptions. Just the compass on his watch and a vague sense of where the trailhead should be. He adjusted his course by instinct and luck. The scream rode with him for a long time. At some point, without him noticing exactly when, it thinned out and faded, leaving only the ringing in his ears and the thud of his own heart. When he burst out of the tree line, the sight of the gravel parking lot felt like walking into a photograph of another life. The cars were still there, all of them, including Nate's. The trunks were closed, the doors were locked. Nothing looked disturbed. Ethan stumbled to his own car, hands shaking. He unlocked it, climbed in, and slammed the door. The silence inside the vehicle felt unnatural, thick, as if the scream had bent the air outside into a shape his brain would never trust again. He sat there, both hands clamped around the steering wheel, and waited for his phone to find a signal. It did. No messages. He drove. The first few hours back in the city were a blur of hot showers, cold takeout, and the kind of sleep that isn't really sleep at all. When Ethan finally checked his phone again, there were voicemails waiting. Not from his friends, from their parents. Carla's mother, voice brittle with forced calm, asking if he'd seen her daughter. Nate's mother, fighting to keep her words steady. Priya's older brother, whose number Ethan hadn't seen in years. Riley's aunt, Jonah's father. They all said some version of the same thing. No one had heard from them. No checked-in photos. No made-it-home texts. No answers to calls. Their jobs were calling too. People who expected them at work Monday and never saw them walk through the door. Ethan listened to each message twice, then 3 times, as if repetition might change the words. He told himself they'd extended the trip, that they'd stomp into his apartment in 2 days laughing about the experiment or the performance piece, that they'd hold up their phones and show him the behind-the-scenes footage. But the voices on those voicemails didn't sound like people who'd been left out of a joke. They sounded like people whose world had tilted. When the questions finally turned toward him, when was the last time you saw them? Did anything unusual happen? Ethan heard his own voice answer with lies that weren't quite lies. They'd gone for a hike. Yes, he'd turned back early. He hadn't felt well. No, there hadn't been an argument. No, he hadn't noticed anything wrong with the trail. He didn't say, "A girl you've never met told a story about a scream in the woods in a bunker in the trees, and then your kids followed her into a part of the forest that shouldn't exist." He didn't say, "They looked at me like I was supposed to know why." Eventually, as he knew they would, the questions stopped coming from parents and started coming from people with badges. They were more precise. They wanted times, distances, weather conditions. They wanted everyone's full names. When Ethan mentioned Mara, they paused. "How do you spell that?" one of them asked. He guessed. The officer typed it into a tablet, waited, frowned. "Last name?" he pressed. Ethan hesitated. "She never said," he admitted, "but she came with Nate. She must be in his contacts, or—" "She's not," the officer cut in gently, eyes on the screen. "We checked his phone with his mother's permission. There's no Mara in his messages, no call history with anyone by that name." Ethan's mouth went dry. "What about his socials?" he asked. "Pictures? DMs? There has to be—" "There isn't," the officer said. "Whoever she is, if she's using that name, she left no trace in anything connected to him." Nate's mother, who'd insisted on sitting in on part of the conversation, stared at Ethan with a confusion that hurt to look at. "He never mentioned a girlfriend," she said. Not since the one in college." Her voice cracked. She swallowed, steadied it. "I brought cookies to his place the night before they left," she added. "He loaded the car while I watched from the window. There was no girl, just him. He hugged me, told me he'd text when they got there." She looked down at her hands. "He didn't." Ethan's skull felt too tight. His brain kept pushing against it, looking for a way out. He excused himself, went home, and lay down on his bed fully dressed. Sleep, when it found him, didn't bring relief. It didn't start with the scream. That would have been too on the nose. The first time the dream came for Ethan, it started with distance. He stood in a forest he didn't recognize, under a sky that looked ordinary, flat gray, no thunderheads, no stars. The trees around him were too evenly spaced. The ground under his boots was too clear. The air felt wrong, too still, too expectant. Somewhere ahead, just far enough that he couldn't see her face, someone was walking. He knew, without knowing how, that it was Mara. Every time he tried to call out, his throat closed. No sound came. She didn't look back. She kept walking, her figure slipping between the trunks like a piece of footage on repeat. Ethan tried to move his legs. They responded, but not like they belonged to him. Each step took more effort than it should. The distance between them never changed. Time folded. Seconds dragged and then snapped. Eventually, whether 10 minutes later or 10 hours, Mara stopped. The scream hit then. Not from ahead, from everywhere. It jammed itself into his ears, into the bones of his jaw, into the soft tissue behind his eyes. It didn't sound exactly like it had in the real forest. That was somehow worse. This version of the sound carried an echo of memory, like it had learned from the first time, added new layers, refined its technique. He wanted to clap his hands over his ears. He couldn't. His arms felt pinned to his sides by invisible weights. Mara turned slightly, enough that he could see the profile of her hood. She wasn't covering her ears. She was listening. The forest rearranged itself around them with dream logic. One moment there were hundreds of trees between them and the source of the sound. The next, there was only one. A thick trunk with bark so dark it almost swallowed the light. Beyond it, where the land dipped down, sat the bunker Mara had described. Ethan had never seen it before with his actual eyes. That didn't matter. His brain recognized it the way it recognized dangerous drop-offs and the glint of teeth. Half buried, no windows. A doorway that wasn't just dark, but black in a way that refused depth. The scream poured out of it like steam from a vent. Mara started forward again. Ethan followed, not because he wanted to, but because not following felt worse. Like there was a hook in his chest now too, threaded through bone and muscle. They reached the doorway, the world cut out. Not the image, not his sense of himself, standing there, breath shallow and fast. Those stayed. The sound went. The scream stopped so abruptly that his inner ears fizzed and popped. For a second he thought he'd gone deaf. Then he heard something much more fragile, his own heartbeat. And underneath it, a second heartbeat, not human, slower, deeper, old. He felt eyes on him before he saw their owner. In the dream, the space inside the bunker refused to resolve into details. Shapes slid in and out of focus. The corners didn't line up. Light had nowhere to bounce off. All he could really see was the impression of a figure standing several steps back from the doorway. It had a human outline. That was where the familiarity ended. Mara's dream, he remembered distantly, had given her a face to recognize. A man responsible. A man she knew. The nightmare that had found him took a different approach. Ethan could feel, in the way the hair on his arms rose and the way his stomach clenched, that the figure inside the bunker was trying on faces, swapping them out like masks backstage, looking for the one that would hurt the most. It settled on something he didn't understand at first. Not a stranger, not himself, not some monster from a movie. It settled on a composite, a blend of all the people he had led into the woods. Carla's eyes, Jonah's jawline, Priya's mouth, Riley's haircut, Nate's crooked grin, overlaid and shifting so quickly that his brain couldn't separate them. The effect was obscene. It was like looking at a wrong answer on a test about his own life. The figure lifted a hand, not to reach for him, to point past him. Ethan forced his neck to turn. Behind him, at the edge of the tree line inside the dream's geography, stood a second figure. Taller than Mara, shoulders set with a posture he recognized only from one angle, seeing himself reflected in his bathroom mirror, tired and unshaven in the morning light. The second figure had his outline, his way of standing, his clothes from the day they'd left for the trip. The man in the doorway of the bunker wasn't accusing Ethan, he was accusing someone else. Two Ethan shapes, one facing the horror, one framed by the trees. The realization slid into place with a nauseating click. In the dream, Ethan wasn't seeing through his own eyes. He was watching someone watch him. The bunker's heartbeat got louder. The composite face twitched, warped, melted, and just before the dream spat him out into his own bedroom, bright afternoon light stabbing through the blinds, Ethan understood one simple, concrete thing. Whatever had taken his friends did not live in the forest. The forest was just where it opened the door. Waking up never felt like waking up anymore. It felt like surfacing from water that didn't want to let him go. The world above the surface, his apartment, his job, the detective's questions, the half-finished meals in his sink, carried on with the stubborn momentum of reality. Deadlines still showed up. Rent still came due. People still asked, "How are you holding up?" in voices that expected a certain script. He learned to say the expected lines. "I'm managing. Just taking it one day at a time. Trying to remember the good stuff." He didn't tell anyone about the bunker. He certainly didn't tell them that the dream had started changing. In some versions, he stood in the forest alone. In others, he watched from a distance while a third figure, not Mara, not himself, walked toward the doorway. Faces blurred, outlines shifted. Sometimes it was a coworker. Sometimes it was a stranger from the bus. Once, horribly, it was Nate's mother, clutching a foil-covered plate of cookies in both hands. Each time the scream was different, individualized, tuned. Each time, just before he woke, the composite face in the doorway would start to stabilize, as if about to settle on someone he knew in the waking world. Each time he bolted awake before he could see it clearly. He didn't know if he was saving himself or doing exactly what the thing wanted, looking away, refusing to understand, keeping the connection frayed but intact. Weeks turned into months. Search efforts tapered off. The case slid from the front page to the second, then into the part of the news cycle that lives mostly in rumor and late-night forums. People online argued about what must have happened. Foul play, a wrong turn on an unmarked trail, a group decision to disappear. Some even accused Ethan of far worse than selfishness. He read the comments until their words blurred. None of them mentioned a girl named Mara. None of them mentioned a scream in the woods that sounded like metal learning to talk. In one of the last formal conversations he had with law enforcement, a tired detective who looked like he hadn't been sleeping any better than Ethan sighed and pushed his chair back from the table. "Sometimes," the man said quietly, "there isn't a neat explanation. People go into places they shouldn't, at times they shouldn't, with people they shouldn't trust. Bad combinations lead to bad outcomes." Ethan stared at the paperwork on the table, at the long list of dates and times with his name on them. He thought of the phrase Nate had used in the woods. "You'll see." It had felt in that moment like a threat. Now, in the long, sleepless nights that followed, it curdled into something worse. A schedule. The thing behind the doorway had time. The forest was only one point on whatever map it used. It didn't need Ethan to go back into the trees. It had already followed him out, stitched to the thin membrane between his sleep and waking. It wasn't interested in punishing him for running. It was interested in using him. Because somewhere out there, in some other town with some other trailhead, another group of people would be saying yes to a simple weekend trip. Another circle of friends, another organizer who booked the cabins and made the lists. And when the time felt right, a stranger with tired eyes and a voice worn smooth by repetition would show up in a passenger seat, saying a name that didn't match any contact list. She wouldn't need to bring a new story. She'd already told it, over and over, in different words, with different faces. The only part that ever needed to stay the same was the ending. Not the missing persons reports, not the voicemails, not the speculation. The real ending sat in the dark, behind a doorway that didn't belong in any set of woods, waiting for the next person to step across the threshold. The next person to hear the scream and decide that knowing mattered more than living. Mara's final sentence around that first campfire had sounded, on the surface, like a simple statement. In the dream, it's always him. Ethan understood now that the dream hadn't been about blame. It had been about direction. It had been about pointing the thing behind the doorway toward a new witness. The night before he finally admitted to himself that he was never going back to the forest, the dream made one last adjustment. No woods, No bunker, no scream. Just a doorway, standing alone in the middle of his bedroom. A perfect rectangle of black, swallowing the light from his bedside lamp. On the other side of it, not hidden, not blurred, stood his reflection. Not in a mirror, in the dark itself. His own face, perfectly still, mouth closed, eyes open. The figure inside the doorway raised a hand in a small, precise motion. Not a wave, a promise. Then the world snapped, and he was awake for real, in a room with no doorway, heart pounding so hard it made his vision pulse. He lay there until sunrise, staring at the blank, ordinary wall where the dream had placed its entrance. People, he decided, tell themselves that nightmares don't mean anything because the alternative is unbearable. In Ethan's case, the alternative was simple and solid, with no room for polite little phrases or comforting hedges. The nightmare meant something. It meant that somewhere out there, the woods were already echoing with a scream that hadn't started yet. And when it did, whoever heard it first would never again be sure whether they were awake, or just standing on the wrong side of a promise someone else had already agreed to keep. Somewhere, another apartment would go dark for the night, while a screen lit up with a stranger telling this exact story. On the other side of that glass, someone would put in headphones, lean back, and let the voice run in the dark, certain it was just entertainment. The thing behind the doorway would recognize the attention, and the endless scream waiting in the trees would take one small, certain step closer to the person who chose to listen all the way to the end.